Welcome back to Without Age 12. And this week I'm once again joined by Steve Tibble, who has recently come out with, last September actually, Assassins and Templars, which I'm of course holding up here. And if you look inside, you can see that it is actually, if you are on YouTube, you can see that it's actually signed as well by the man himself. And I had the great pleasure of being invited to the publishing party last month when the book came out, which was great fun to meet the gang and so many friends and some new people as well. So it was a great fun. And we are of course this week going to discuss his book Assassins and Templars. And first of all, like I usually do, the drill by now. What inspired you to write about both the Assassins and the Templars at the same time?
Yeah. Thank you, Erland, and thank you for coming last month. It was fantastic. That was such a nice
Such a
party,
blast.
and so nice to see you. Well, I love stories. I'm a very simple soul, so I love a good story. And the thing that I know, I did two books previously. One on the Templars, and there were loads of stories. There were too many stories for the book, and one big set of stories was how they interacted with the assassins, and I loved it, but I couldn't find a space for it. And I was intrigued by the way these two crazy groups actually knew each other and had these crazy relationships. So I was pretty desperate to write the book. It just kind of wrote itself.
And they kind of have some, as you touched on in the book as well, they kind of have so many similarities as well. The only real difference is their religion, of course, but other than that, they're kind of pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It is, in a way, it's slightly depressing because it basically confirms, that we're all just a bunch of monkeys. You put a bunch of monkeys in a room with a similar problem, and probably they'll come up with a similar solution. And we can extrapolate and come up with very complicated answers. But actually, when you see this kind of thing happening, these guys ostensibly have nothing in common at all, as you say. I mean, the very opposite ends of the religious spectrum, geographically different and so on, but they have similar problems, and bizarrely, they come up with the same solution. And it's fascinating to see how it plays out in practice.
So let's begin with the origins of the Assassins. And of course, most people probably think about the first thing they do, and we'll touch upon this by the end of the episode, I'm sure. They probably think about the Assassin's Creed video game, because there are, as well, you have Assassins and Templars. And we will again touch upon this by the end of the episode, of course. But it's a little different in real life, of course. But let's begin with the origins of the assassins, and there's a lot of misconceptions regarding, even in Islamic communities, I believe there is a lot of misconceptions, mostly because propaganda against the assassins. So let's begin. Before we get into that, I want to talk about the origins of the assassins and where they started out to become. The Nisaris, I believe, is if I remember correctly, is an actual term, I think, that they used. And they weren't called assassins until fairly recently, I believe.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in a way, we should be pedantic here. So this is important that it's an assassin with an uppercase A. We're used to talking about assassins, and we think of the Godfather or contract killers. And in reality, that's all very modern. But what we're talking about is assassins with an uppercase A. This is a real group of real people, a real organization, and a real community. So it's quite different. They did kill people, so we can't get away from that. They were killers when they needed to be, but pretty much everybody was at that time. It's politics was a very rough business. I think the best way to describe the assassins is they're kind of and they are literally religious extremists. They're at the extreme end of various splits within Islam. So speaking very, very in a very generalized way, Islam split into Sunni and Shiite. Shiites split into many groups, one of which was the kind of Ismaili branch of Shiism, and then again, overgeneralizing, the Ismailis split into different branches, one of which, as you quite rightly say, were the Nizari Ismailis, because their first leader was Nizar. And these guys, so these Nizari Ismailis, are a split from a split from a split. So they're quite at the extreme end of Islam at that time. They've since changed. They're much more mainstream now. Even my dentist is an assassin, and you couldn't find a more charming man than him. He hurts, but not only in a good way. So they were very different in the 12th and 13th century, and basically the Nizari Ismailis set up a kind of their own principality in Persia, in modern day Iran, fighting against the Sunni Turks who'd taken over Iran. So it was a bit like kind of Vietnam War. It's a kind of nationalist uprising with an ideological carapace. So these guys were fighting really a nationalist war, but they were also fighting a religious war against the Turks. And they then, once they started doing that, they set up another branch of the Assassins in Syria. And that's where the Assassin's Creed comes in, because there, the guys in Syria became famous. That was where their big leader, Sinan, who we can come back to later, who was who features in Assassin's Creed. He was the first old man of the mountain, and they set up a whole network of castles and communities. Yeah, they're kind of an extreme sect, is the best way to look at it, but with a particular emphasis in their foreign policy of murdering people. So it's the fact that they're called assassins isn't totally wrong.
So let's talk begin with how they actually were able to establish so many castles. And like I think, believe if I remember correctly, in the book you write about how they kind of were a failed attempt to establish a country. But how did because and I imagine the running of customers trust and they weren't, as we said, they weren't quite popular sect among, because of course they were Shiite and they were this cultish group. So how did they manage to get funding for these projects and castles, and with the where did the unpopularity start with this sect of the I'm not going to use, for the lack of better words, assassins, even though that's not accurate to them. I'm going to use assassins anyway.
Yeah.
But how did the assassins manage to establish this? So many. Well, what were they interested in joining the assassins in the first place?
Yeah. No, you're right. We know how expensive it was to run a castle, to build a castle, because we've got some of we haven't got the building invoices that the assassins might have used, but we do have some from the Templars, interestingly, and it's massive. It's like building an aircraft carrier, and it's not just an aircraft carrier with a one-off cost. You have to garrison it, you have to maintain it. It's hideously expensive. So you could, and in a funny sort of way, I was very pleased to discover the economics of it, because to me, one of the big questions, one of the big problems of the assassins is, so, okay, these guys are Shiite extremists. They're very secretive. They like to be set apart. They like their privacy. But you do find them from time to time killing people as contract killers, taking money from the local Sunni leaders to kill other Sunnis or maybe crusaders. So you think, wow, why are these guys reducing themselves to that? Why do they need to do that? And then you look at the economics. What are the economics of? It's a bit like Tolkien. It's like elven woodland creatures. The elves. What on earth are the economics of running Rivendell or whatever? And it's the same, well, different, but the same with the assassins. I think they had real trouble with money, and it does help to explain why they were occasionally prepared to accept cash contracts to do what they did best, which was kill people who were difficult to get to.
Now here's the next thing that I find fascinating about the assassins, and of course, this is probably, if you are a history buff, you probably know a little bit about them. And one of the most popular known that people think that they know about the assassins is that they smoked hashish. Where kind of a term assassin come from before they were killing someone, and then they would go into, and then they knew they would go and die. That's why they smoked hashish, and that's one of the biggest misconceptions about them. Is they would of course not go voluntarily. They would always try to escape after assassinating someone. So let's talk about the actual driving of how they, would go about murders of them. And there's some of the misconceptions around the assassins finding someone they
Yeah, yeah,
wanted to kill.
yeah. No, absolutely. Well, obviously, you and I we've never had hashish, but
Yeah.
my friends tell me that it's a narcotic. Basically it dulls the senses, um, and I find it completely implausible. I couldn't find any evidence that the assassins, their hit squads, had actually taken hashish or any other kinds of drugs. Certainly not alcohol. The last thing you want in the middle of a hit is to be relaxed, um, almost anesthetized. You want to have a Mars bar. It's the opposite of what you want. You actually want your guys to be like, James Bond or, the Bourne Identity. You want them to be really on their game, really sharp. So I think the thing about drugs is uh, it's a misconception, but it's a deliberate misconception. I think it's one of the things that's got its origins in the Sunni enemies of the assassins, because when they said they were hashashin, what they really meant was, well, these are a bunch of junkies. These are kind of low life scumbags. Um, so it was partly about drugs, but it was also saying that they're a bunch of sad losers. And it was a way of explaining in a very negative way why those assassin killers were so committed. So basically they knew that they were very brave. They knew that they were very committed to their cause. And to make it look more petty, they decided to say, oh well, they're only doing it because they're drugged. But I don't think it was the case at all. I think they did it because they were devoted to their religious beliefs and their community.
So, what do we actually have any inside info on, the running of the training of assassins on, and how they would choose the target? You mentioned contract killers, but as well we know that they had enemies they wanted to dispose of as well. So let's talk a little bit about their own, how they chose which one enemies were dangerous and how they were going about actually assassinating someone. Would they go in groups, or would they go in how would they go about approaching this?
Yeah. So there's two questions there really. One is the what's the HR program in training, and what did an assassin hit group look like? So sadly, I mean, I did look for it. Sadly, there are no emails from the HR department saying what your training program is going to be. We
Oh,
There were some malicious stories. If you if you read Marco Polo, there's this kind of story, and I think the Sunnis propagated this as well. There's a story that the old man of the mountain drugged his young followers, young male fit followers, and in a state of, kept them aside from everybody else in a nice, pretty garden, and introduced them to women. And in their state of, drug induced psychosis, they would believe they were in paradise. And so their training in terms of motivation was to say, okay, guys, if you die, you just come back to this garden and you just get a whole bunch of new girls waiting for you. So, but to me, those are just stories. You don't, as with the hashish, there's no evidence that that's true. I think actually what you do find in terms of training is the guys are very good with weapons. We've got eyewitness accounts of them fighting with very skilled warriors, and they're very, very dangerous people. Even though they only have daggers, usually they are awesome fighters. And I imagine, and I'm sure I'm right in saying that weapons training, particularly with daggers, concealed weapons, would have been a big part of their training. We also know that they used to put people, their hit squads, who were called the Fideus, the guys who actually did the killing were called Fideus, that they often had to infiltrate the enemy. So they had to pretend to be, maybe pretend to be Christian, maybe pretend to be Sunni, had to pretend to be different roles. They might pretend to be a spy, they might pretend to be a soldier or whatever. So they would have had to have known some language skills. So I'd be surprised if there wasn't an element of language training. And there was a lot of cultural empathy. To pretend to be a Christian, you not only have to have a language, but you have to have an understanding of what Christians believe, where they come from, what cultural differences they have from the rest of the people in that region. So I suspect they were highly trained, perhaps in a not structured way, but in a very, very real sense. They would have been highly trained individuals, and there were very few numbers of them. They were a very precious commodity. So you wouldn't send these guys out without the proper training. And I think they were, highly trained and very, very dangerous. To your other question about what the hit squad would look like, it's normally very small. Like with the Templars, we always think of the Templars as having huge armies, but actually the number of Brother Templars was maybe a few hundred. I mean, they punched above their weight, and it's the same with the Assassins. There's one hit against Saladin where there may have been 13 guys in the hit squad, but a normal hit squad was maybe 3 or 4 people, or it could just be 1 or 2. These are very tiny groups, because the whole essence of being a good assassin is not in numbers, it's in penetrating through the enemy's defenses and catching them off their guard. And you can do that with one man. You don't need 10,000 cavalry for that. And that's the heart of what made the assassin so dangerous.
So there's also the five fairs. There's one rather grotesque. I don't know how true the story is. Again, it could be more a myth rather than actual history. But one story that you have that kind of stuck with me was, I believe that the old man in Sinan, I think it was, would ask them to actually jump a cliff, and they would actually jump off the cliff in fierce loyalty to Sinan. And again, I don't remember if this was actually more of a myth or actual history, but that's also tells you something about the loyalty to the Nisaris as well.
No, that's a very good point. Very good point, Erland. And it's an important story because it says a lot about what people thought of the Assassins and what the Assassins wanted people to think about them. And that level of commitment and fanaticism, some people might say, well, that just means they're nutcases. But from an assassin's point of view, it means I've succeeded. You're scared of me, and you're right to be scared. I'm really, really dangerous. So even though I'm a tiny group of people with no big armies, you still have to take me seriously. So in a way, it's a legend and propaganda that suited everybody. It suited their enemies because it showed the assassins were crazy, but the assassins actually wanted to be feared. You hear that story from lots of different places. You hear about it from many different sources who wouldn't have connected with each other. You hear the story from Christians, you hear it from Sunni Muslims. There's a whole, almost a kind of theater about it. There's a very dramatic thing. And Sinan was a very theatrical, dramatic person. He dressed in a certain way. He'd come on, when he first came into the mountains, he had his, a particular dress. He was he was very austere, but strangely flamboyant as well. And it's something that I could just about see it happening. I mean, it may just be propaganda. The one thing to say is that assassins were very precious. You would not ask your men to kill themselves lightly because
they didn't have unlimited men or
so
resources.
Oh, no, absolutely right. I mean, they're a very, very limited resource. The number of highly trained and committed young men in that position is always small. So, but having said that, the story comes up so often in so many different sources who wouldn't have had contact with each other that I can't help but think maybe there was a small element of truth in it, and that maybe 1 or 2 people would be wheeled out to make a big demonstration. And interestingly, it's one of the features of the Assassins that is in Assassin's Creed in the video game. You get the guys jumping off, and in fact, they have them, I think, secretly jumping onto bales of hay or straw underneath, so they survive the fall. And I don't know if that would be true. I think ultimately we just don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised either way.
Now, we have talked a lot about the Assassins and the British, of course, Assassins and Templars. So let's take a little break from the Assassins. We will go into them and the Templars a little later, but let's talk a little bit about the Templars as well. And we, of course, touched upon them in a few other episodes that you've been on. But talk a little bit about the Templars as well and see the similarity. As we talked about in the beginning, you see the similarities between the Templars and the Assassins. But let's talk a little bit about the Templars as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The Templars obviously are very different ideologically. They come from Christianity rather than Islam. Um, but there are so many similarities, it's worth pointing them out. I mean, they're both tiny groups. We're still talking, they're both famous now. We're still talking about them. They did very powerful things and they made a big impression in their own lifetime. So they were both legends even when they were alive. And
But
they're still
both
legends
weren't
now.
very well liked either by
Well,
both sides.
yeah. No, you don't. They're both very dangerous groups of people. So that's not calculated to make friends. You probably wouldn't want to go on a beach holiday with either of them. Really, they're dangerous people. But I think one of the tricks that they managed to do was to make themselves look bigger than they actually were. So the whole point of having a legend is that your image is huge and scary. Uh, but it's sort of like the Wizard of Oz. You get this tiny little guy in the middle of a machine who's sort of creating a big image. And they both managed to do that. There weren't that many Templars, but they were great on the battlefield. They had great castles. They were great lawyers and what have you. So they really, both groups punched above their weight. I mean, the other weird thing is that they sort of had the same problems because, as you mentioned, they're not popular guys. They don't have many friends. They're quite arrogant. They're quite dangerous. Ideologically, they're not popular. So the Templars are a tiny group of extreme Christians. They're all devout Catholics in a region of the world that's dominated by Muslim powers. You've got the Ismailis, the Assassins, who are an extreme Muslim sect, but they're not even popular with the other Ismailis. The Ismailis in Egypt hate them and they both kill each other. And the Sunnis, who are their big neighbors, hate them. So they're both hugely outnumbered and despised, you know? So they both have this same problem, which is how do we punch above our weight continually? How do we save our communities? The other weird thing is, and the reason why the Assassin's Creed association of the two groups is not as crazy as it looks, is that they were in the same time and the same place. So they both groups emerged, well, the ideologies behind them emerged in the late 11th century, early 12th century. They both came to an end, towards the end of the 13th century, beginning of the 14th. They both were in the same place. They were both in, what we currently call Lebanon, in the case of a lot of the Assassins places, but the Templars, that was a big area for the Templars as well. So they were both in this same tiny place at the same time with the same problems. And bizarrely, they even had really boring relationships like landlords and tenants. They were so close that they were, the Assassins were paying tribute to the Templars for a lot of the time. The Templars were the only people who were crazy enough, apart from the Hospitallers, to extort money from the world's most dangerous people. It was fabulous. The other big thing they had in common is that they were corporations, which sounds very boring, but actually, if you think, most of the states in that world, most of the big power blocks in that time and place were family businesses. So these are guys who are very vulnerable. They're run by individual men. These men have sons who are their heirs. They have wives who they love. They have other relatives. So if you can kill the head of the head of Damascus, you really have destabilized your enemy. Whereas if you kill the old man of the mountain or the master of the Templars, it's all you've got is a bunch of angry assassins and a bunch of angry Templars. Because by the following Tuesday, there'll be a new master of the Templars and a new old man of the mountain. Because they're corporations, they can't be blackmailed by individual death. And that's the key they both had.
Now let's talk a little bit about some differences. Just pointed out a lot of similarities, but as we also mentioned, I think you should look at the differences between the Assassins and Templars as well. Obviously, we have pointed out the main one, that the Assassins were also contracted killers, but But what are the different? And the Templars were more protector boss, if you will, but obviously one. But let's talk a little bit about some of the differences between the Assassins and the Templars.
Yeah, I have to say they were both protective forces. I mean, both groups were trying to protect their own communities, which were, so the Templars were there to try and protect the local Christian communities. The Assassins were trying to protect their religious community. But there were, obviously there are differences, and it's partly because they were so similar. This whole thing that people who are too much alike sometimes don't get on.
Yeah,
And I think you find that with the Templars and the Assassins, that the Templars are almost the only people that the Assassins are scared of. They sort of, which is why they pay the money to leave them alone. They're the big bullies. And you find even, the Assassins are surprisingly flexible in terms of, the intellectual side of their life and religious. So they were prepared to talk to the Christians. They often got on much better with their Christian neighbors than they did with their Muslim neighbors, because their Muslim neighbors thought they were heretics, whereas the Christian neighbors just couldn't care less. They didn't know what a Muslim heretic would even look like. Strangely, they got on better with the Crusaders than you might think. But with the Templars, because they were so similar, when the Assassins were getting very close to the Crusader states and they were becoming allies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1173, 1174, the Templars really didn't like it. They thought, no, these guys, they're our bitches. We want to kick them around, and we don't want them to be allies. So they found the big diplomatic caravan that the Assassins had sent to Jerusalem, and there was an agreement with the king of Jerusalem waiting to be signed. And when the diplomats came back on their way back into the Assassins' castles, a bunch of Templar hitmen ambushed them out of nowhere and absolutely wiped them out. A guy called Walter de Menil, and his men. Walter was this guy, crazy sort of hitman. One eye, huge scarring. He's just almost like a comic book. Hard assassin himself, and they just wiped them out. So they rubbed up against each other. And I think it's partly because they are so similar. The two, it's like Aliens versus Predator. You got two big forces there that are fighting each other.
so I want to talk a little bit about some of the famous assassination attempts or such by the how. And before we do that, how often were the assassins successful in actually taking out someone if they were decided that this guy need to go? What were the success rate of a murder,
Yeah.
and how often would one be able to get away? Because as I believe we touched on in the beginning, if you were going in to murder someone, there, there was a very small chance that you would get away, but of course they would always try to. It wasn't like they knew they were going, or they kind of knew, but the goal wasn't to die if you after you to kill yourself after you successfully murdered someone. So they would always try to escape. But let's talk a little bit about the success rate of and how the chances of actually getting away for an assassin once you actually were able to murder someone or attempted to murder someone.
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, it's there is a misconception that the Templars and the Assassins were kind of suicide squads, particularly the Assassins, and that's not true at all. I mean, the Templars were devout Catholics. Suicide is not something that Catholics do. It's a mortal sin. And similarly with the Assassins, there were so few of them. They were looking to escape. They weren't. And I think the key difference is both groups were not afraid to die. And the fact that they were committed to death was the source of their power. But what they weren't committed to do was dying just for the sake of it. They wanted to achieve something through their
They
death.
weren't like
So,
modern terrorist groups in like Al Qaeda or ISIS. They were like suicide bombers, to put it that way.
no, they weren't. No, you're right. I mean, they are like certain other, like if you look at the IRA, which would have been guys who were raised as Catholics. They were terrorists, but they weren't suicide bombers. They weren't looking to die in the course of their actions. So there is Well, I mean, if you're on the receiving end of them, it looks kind of a little bit theoretical, but in reality, they are not suicide squads, neither of them. Now, you raised a very good point about how successful were they, and I think there's two ways of measuring that success. Really, there's a kind of tactical success, as in, what percentage of hit squads get through to their target and kill the man. I mean, it is, I think, without exception, men, and it's men killing men. This is a very, well, like all criminality, it's a very heavily gendered activity that we're talking about here. I mean, it's literally 100% men. I mean,
And
the
this is the
Templars are
12th
100%
century,
male.
so women weren't exactly in power at this time.
No, absolutely.
Some were behind the scenes, but not in public.
Sure. Yeah, no, obviously they had important roles to play, but particularly in this area and in this time and in these groups, it was the guys doing the horrible work, actually, and nothing to be proud about in that. It's hard to say what they're, you couldn't put a percentage to it, I don't think, partly because
most weren't successful, were they? They were just, they tried, but most would fail. And one famous attempt, of course, is the mention of you, Saladin and Edward I. The attempt on Edward I when he was on Crusade as well. Most weren't successful, I think we can say.
That may be true. It is hard to say because often they would kill people in secret, and you wouldn't even know that the assassins had done it. For instance, there was another Ismaili. Right. There was an Ismaili ruler in Egypt who was murdered, and everybody, until quite recently, thought that it was part of the internal politics of Egypt because they're ferocious. But then fairly recently, there was a script found of an Ismaili record of what happened, and it was actually a hit squad of 3 of their guys, and they had parties to celebrate back in Persia where the assassins had come from. But they never told anyone. They just wrote it in their own local records, and so it was very secret. We don't know how many hits they launched, so we can never really know what percentage was successful.
I mean, it was more spectacular when an attempt failed, right? That was more kind of news rather than an actual successful.
Well, that's true. I mean, having and so for instance, the big one is, I guess, Saladin. They were in a conspiracy to kill him in 1173 with the Crusaders. 73, 74. They tried to kill him in 1175 with a big group of 13 assassins, nearly killed him. They tried to kill him again in 1176. They're trying to kill him every year, and their guys get wiped out every time. But having said all that, and the same with the thing about the attack on Edward I, Edward was fantastic. He's like a James Bond figure, and he sort of punches the assassin, even though he's unarmed, half asleep, he still punches the assassin to the ground, sticks a knife through his skull into his face, and kills him. But interestingly, he never comes back to Palestine. It's like you have to say, what is a successful hit? It doesn't have to be just killing someone. It's kind of making a.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting you, but I just also wanted to point out that what makes the assassination attempt on Edward I more fascinating is that he also, he attempted to. Actually, he was kind of a spy, was infiltrated inside as his servant for a number of months, a number of time. That's perhaps what's the most interesting part until Israel finally decided they were to try to assassinate Edward I. So that's perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of the murder attempt to me, that they actually worked for him for a number of times.
And they'd used a very similar methodology just a few months earlier against Philip de Montfort and his his relatives. And it comes back to your point about training. These guys infiltrated. They were very plausible. They were the kind of guys who could go deep undercover. But I think it's an obvious success if you kill someone. What's a less obvious success is if you scare everyone. But that can be just as powerful. So people in, when King Louis IX was out in the Holy Land, his guys were absolutely petrified that the assassins were going to get to him. There was in reality, no hint that they were planning to. They had quite a decent dialogue. Louis sent emissaries to the assassins and vice versa, and they were talking nicely. But everybody was scared of them, and that's their strategic success. Is that they, even though they're a tiny group, they're quite poor, they're deeply unpopular, they still manage to get a place at the table in terms of regional politics because they punched above their weight. And if you could describe them as terrorists, it's like, I don't like the word terrorist, but if you think that if they were that, they were showing that terrorism can work, that you can exert and project
Because
power,
Aladdin got quite
even though you're
paranoid, didn't
small.
he?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's one famous incident where he was walking with Joinville. So Louis and Joinville were walking near a church, I think outside Acre or Sidon, and there was a local native priest, Christian, who was saying mass, and Louis wanted to go to mass there, but Joinville and all of the other bodyguards were saying, "Oh no, don't go there. He could be an assassin." And then they described what the priest looked like. He was tall and skinny and dark-skinned, dark hair, which and the guy wasn't an assassin. He was just a local Christian. But it shows what they were scared of and what they thought the assassins looked like. And ultimately, the assassins could look like whatever you want, because that's how they went into deep cover.
Now, I know we don't have too much time, so let's begin talking about the decline of both sects, the Templars and the Assassins, because like you said earlier, they would end up paying tribute to the Templars, and that would, I think, is a clear sign of decline in the Assassins. But what caused the decline in both sects from, and when did the decline, was there obvious signs of decline?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I think the seeds of the problem were always there, because they're small, they're poor, they're hated. It's not a great hand of cards. To me, the weird thing is that the Templars and the Assassins hung around for 200 years and were powerful players. That's more weird than the fact that they went into decline. I mean, a lot of modern states don't last 200 years, and they have much bigger resources. But the thing with the Assassins, I think, was that they sometimes believed their own propaganda. So they behaved like they were the big bully in the playground, and occasionally, and often that worked, and that's what kept them alive. But occasionally they would come up against somebody who really was the big bully in the playground, and then suddenly they looked pretty stupid. So you find from the 1250s, the Mongols enter the region, and the Assassins initially feel this could be good news, because the Mongols are killing a lot of Sunni Muslims, and the Assassins think, wow, okay, they can't be all bad if they're doing that. But then they fall out with the Mongols, and they make the mistake of doing what they do best, which is killing one of the leaders just to make a point. And the mistake they make is that the Mongols are this huge bully. They are so remorseless. So they just absolutely wipe out the assassins in Persia. I mean, it is genocidal. They kill everybody, pets, children, women, everything, because they won't be in the same room as the assassins anymore. They despised them. So the assassins in Persia are just wiped out because they get too Bolshevik for their own good. Then very quickly, the Mongols, ironically, meet somebody who's even more, horrific than they are, in the form of the Mamluks and Baibars. Who's Sultan Baibars. He's a really tough character. I mean, he's ruthless. And I think the assassins in Syria, for a while, thought, oh, this is great. Yeah, the Mongols have gone now. But they were mistaken again, because all that they'd done is just trade one horrible enemy for another one, and Baibars just absolutely kicked them around. Interestingly, he didn't wipe them out. He didn't do the blunt instrument of genocide, which is what the Mongols tried to do. He had a much more subtle plan. He wanted kind of like consultants. So he would use them and as his creatures, and he would give them contracts. So he'd say, I need Philip of Montfort taken out, I need Prince Edward assassinated, and that he'd pay them for it. But the big payment was that he protected their communities. He allowed their communities to survive, and didn't wipe them out because they became his kind of core of hitmen. So he took over all the castles, and the assassins really just became a part of his entourage that he could use as a threat if he was negotiating with anybody. And we still have some of the documents, actually, where he puts little sort of codicils in treaties saying, if I don't like you, I may send the assassins to kill you. Hope that's all right. And then they both signed the agreement. And yeah, scary guy.
So what about the Templars decline? Because they would last a little longer, as you said, into the 14th century. And of course, the trial in France, I think it was Louis IX, or I don't remember which one, but with the
Philip the
Philip
Fifth.
the Fair, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the decline of the Templars as well.
Yeah. So again, they have a similar problem because they're big talkers, but they're actually small in number. The problem they have is that they had one job. The job of the Templars is to save the Holy Land for Christendom. And after 1291, when the Acre fell and the last Crusader states came to an end, really, on the mainland anyway.
The purpose kind of run out.
It was, yeah, absolutely. So they had one job to do, and they'd shown, and they'd failed to do it. So they were redundant. Basically, they were guys without a job, and they were also quite arrogant guys without a job, and they were guys without a job who also had a fair bit of land, and people thought they had a lot of money sloshing around. So they became a very tempting target, and the French monarchy had a methodology for getting money when the bank was nearly empty. They would find a vulnerable group, and then they would torture them and arrest them until they handed over all their money. They did that with the Italian bankers. They did it with the Jewish community. Did it with the lepers, and they did that to the Templars. So they were crushed, really, so that their assets could be confiscated by the French state.
Now, before we go, there is some. You mentioned this earlier, and I want to talk about the Templars and Assassins in popularity today. Obviously, they're still quite popular both in myth and in games. And we talked about Assassin's Creed earlier, and I want to start there with the Assassin's Creed. And of course, I want to talk a little bit about the Kingdom of Heaven as well, as the Templars are portrayed there in the movie as kind of a little bit villainous in the movie from my remembrance. So, but let's begin with Assassins and Templars in Assassin's Creed, because the Assassins are kind of the heroes and the Templars are the villain. But of course, it's a little bit different because they're trying to, if you play the games tonight. But let's talk a little bit about their portrayal in the video games franchise known as Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I'm always surprised how authentic it feels. So I have played Assassin's Creed. I'm not a super expert, but I've felt the authenticity. I love it when you're walking around, Masyaf
I reckon that's the first game.
Yeah, exactly, the classic game. Yeah, 2007, the original. It's very it's set in the same period. It's at the Third Crusade, so around about 1192, and it does have this world where, as you say, the Assassins are good and the Templars bad, but it's more complicated than that. And Assassin's Creed is a fantasy game, so they don't pretend. It's not a history lecture. They don't pretend it's real, but it does give you a good feel for it. And some of the characters are real characters, like Sinan, the old man of the mountain, is real. Robert de Sablé, who's the Templar leader at the time, is a real character. And Richard Lionheart and so on. There are real characters dotted around. And I think they do that very well. I mean, but they deliberately blur the lines because I think it's a modern thing. We don't see things as being good or bad. So Sinan, who, although he's head of the Assassins, we find out at one point he's actually a Templar as well. I mean, it's obviously crazy. It's got no historical foundations to it. But they're trying to, in a way, in the same way as I discovered with the book, that these two groups actually have more in common with each other than they might believe or might even be comfortable with.
So, of course, I mentioned Kingdom of Heaven as well, though they don't play a huge part there. I want to talk a little bit about how you feel about, and I want to do a movie review eventually of the Kingdom of Heaven, but Let's talk a little bit about the Templars' role in the movie, as that came out, I believe, in 2004-ish, around that time. So
Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about Templars' role there.
yeah. I mean, again, they are his typecasting. They're the baddies again. They so Jeremy Irons as the Marshal of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is the hero together with Balian of Ibelin, and the Hospitallers actually are seen as more reasonable characters. Whereas the Templars and Reynaud de Chatillon are seen as the kind of crazy fanatics. And there is some foundation to that. Reynaud de Chatillon and Gerard de Ridefort, who was master of the Templars at the time, were both, you know, extreme characters. They were both quite rough and ready, and so on. They were both incredibly brave. Neither of them were kind of cardboard cutout two-dimensional characters. They both had a lot of depth, even though the film portrays them in a fairly two-dimensional way. I think it partly is a reflection of the fact that people like the Hospitallers were actually probably a little bit more reasonable, and they cared for the sick, they cared for the poor, and they did fighting. That was part of their role. Whereas the Templars were straight down the line. They're the elite soldiers. That's all they do. They don't do anything else. So they are slightly more extreme than the Hospitallers. And in Gerard de Ridefort, they had a leader who was I find him a difficult character. He's not a good decision maker. I think he's got the wrong job. If he's commanding a squadron, I could see Gerard being good at that. He's brave and he's military, so he's good at that. What he's not good at, I think, is strategy. So he's not good in making his decisions to charge at the Battle of Cresson. He's not good in advising King Guy to fight at Hattin and so on. So I think there's an element of truth in it. It's the other thing is like Assassin's Creed. The Kingdom of Heaven is not a history lecture. It's an entertainment, and I think I love it because it's beautiful. So I'm not criticizing it, and I actually think if it was a binary choice, you have to say, are the Templars under Gerard de Ridefort good or bad? You'd have to say they're bad, yeah, because he led them into doing bad things that were bad for their own people.
Now, the final thing I want to talk about is in general how the Templars and Assassins are viewed in the 21st century. And among right-wing extremists, the Templars are very popular. Is it the same in, like terrorist groups in the right extremist Islam that, the Assassins are viewed in kind of the same way that right-wing extremists view the Templars, for example, in the 21st century, or is there, aren't they as popular as the Templars are for? And I'm bringing up right-wing extremists because they really use them to prove go that they were the best bastion of Christian values and so forth. But let's talk a little bit about a general view of the Templars and Assassins in the 21st century. We mentioned the games, but in general, popular imagination.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I have to say, I'm not an expert on Islamic groups. I would have to say, I don't think they are idolized on the world of Islamic extremism in the same way as the Templars are idolized by the more right-wing extremists, partly because the Assassins are Shiites, and a lot of people like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, are, as far as I know, they're Sunni. So they would see them as heretics rather than role models. They're not going to be poster boys for a Sunni movement. The Templars, funnily enough, they do have some qualities that would appeal to a right-wing group. They're very good militarily, they're very brave, they're European, they're very pro-Christian. So those things are true. Where I think it goes wrong from a right-wing perspective in some cases is that there's an assumption that somehow makes the Templars racist, which there's almost no evidence of whatsoever. Most, the brothers themselves were European, but most people in a Templar army were going to be Arabs or Armenians or Syrians, because a lot of the population were local Christians. So, Christian Arabs probably would have been the major part of some Templar garrisons.
And as we said in this episode, they worked with the Assassins and several, as we touched on before, they worked with several Islamic groups as well. So the idea of racism, is totally wrong.
Yeah. And one of the things they were accused of when they were closed down in the 14th century was being too cozy with the local Muslims. And there was an element of truth in that. Not in that they were being traitors, but that they were wise in the minutiae of local politics. They were political players. They weren't just fanatics who hated people because of their religion or their skin color. They were very much not like that. And in fact, nowadays a lot of people are obsessed with racial issues, on the left wing and the right wing. But that wasn't the case in the Middle Ages. They were much more obsessed with religion. That's where
There
you
were
became an
religious
outcast because you had the
racism.
wrong religion. There was religious bigotry rather than ethnic bigotry, I think. Yeah, primarily.
I think we
But
done
no, very good point.
Thank you again for coming on. I think we're gonna round it
Hmm.
up there. I know we're a little bit over time, but of course, it's been a great pleasure to have you on, as always. Before you go, where can people find your book, Assassins and Templars, and the other books you've written on this subject? If people want to ask you questions, where can people find you on social media if they have further questions regarding this topic and other topics that we have discussed previously?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Alan. It's always a pleasure talking to you. It's always fun. I'm just starting my own kind of YouTube channel with Tony McMahon, who's a famous Templar sort of commentator. It's called Talking Templars, so you might be able to find that on YouTube. I've got a website called stevetibble.com because it's a silly name, so I can get that website. And you can find my books, most of which are published by Yale University Press. They're absolutely beautiful books. Yale do a great job, and you can find them in all good bookshops or on the Yale website or even Amazon, all of the good places.
Thank you again so much for coming on. As I mentioned, this is the third time that Steve is on this podcast, and I'm hoping for at least a dozen more times that he will come back, of course. And
Fingers crossed.
please check out the other episodes that we've done. The first one was misconceptions about the Knight Templars. We also discussed his previous book, Crusader Criminals. I think that was back in May or March, and I think it was March. Don't remember. Also check out other episodes that we've done on the podcast. We have a lot, so I'm sure you will find something that you like. This will be about that age as well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider give us 5 stars if you like this episode. Or you can give us one. It's a free world, at least at this point in time, or this side of the world. Or you can also leave a comment. What are your thoughts on the Templars and the Assassins? And of course, if you're on YouTube, leave a comment as well. Or you can like, share, and subscribe. If you're on Apple Podcast, do write a review and also, of course, share our podcast. That will be tremendously helpful. And yeah, like, share. We are available on social media under H12 on Blue Sky, Twitter, and mainly on Twitter and Instagram. So you can check us out there, both for that H12. Like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.